The emergency room doors burst open so violently that everyone inside turned at once, and then the German Shepherd came charging through them, soaked from the rain, panting hard, dragging a broken length of leash behind him. A woman screamed. Someone dropped a metal tray. Two security officers rushed forward, while a frightened father pulled his young son against his chest. But the dog did not look at any of them. He ran straight down the center of the emergency department as if he knew exactly where he was going. Nurse Elena Brooks had only seconds to react before the animal stopped in front of her, lifted his head, and stared directly into her eyes. There was something in that stare that made her forget the shouting around her. It was not aggression. It was urgency. Desperation. Almost pleading. Elena stood frozen beside the nurse's station, one hand still holding a chart, while the canine's chest rose and fell beneath his soaked black fur. A thin red mark crossed the side of his harness, and a small silver identification tag swung against his ribs with every breath. Behind him, security shouted for everyone to clear the hallway. Someone yelled that the dog might be dangerous. Elena barely heard them. She had spent 11 years working in emergency medicine, long enough to know that panic often made people see danger where there was only fear. The dog suddenly turned away from her and ran toward the treatment corridor. Then he looked back. Once. Twice. As if waiting for her to follow. Elena took one step forward. Security blocked her path. The older officer raised a hand and told her not to move. The animal was trained. It could be confused. It could be unpredictable. But Elena watched the dog's eyes, and something about him felt painfully familiar. Not the animal itself. Though look. She had seen it before in the faces of people who arrived at the hospital carrying news they could not say out loud. She slowly lowered the chart in her hand. The dog whined softly. Then he turned toward the corridor again. Elena looked at the officer and told him to give her 30 seconds. Nobody answered. The canine suddenly pulled against the broken leash and disappeared around the corner. Elena followed. The emergency department was never truly quiet, but that afternoon the noise seemed to gather behind her like a storm. Monitors beeped. Wheels rattled across the polished floor. Doctors called for medications. Families whispered beneath fluorescent lights. Yet the farther Elena walked, the more certain she became that the dog was leading her somewhere. He stopped outside a treatment room and pressed his nose against the closed door. Elena recognized the room immediately. It had been occupied less than 20 minutes earlier by an unidentified man brought in after a roadside accident. The patient had arrived without a wallet, without a phone, and without anyone who could identify him. His injuries were serious, but what had unsettled Elena was the way he kept looking toward the ambulance doors before losing consciousness. Now the canine stood outside his room, trembling. Elena reached for the handle. The dog stepped closer. A doctor inside shouted that they were still stabilizing the patient. Elena opened the door just enough to see the bed. The man lay beneath a white sheet, surrounded by equipment and hurried medical staff. His face was pale. His eyes were closed. On the floor beside the bed sat a pair of muddy work boots that paramedics had removed before bringing him inside. Elena looked down at them. Something was tied to one bootlace. A narrow strip of blue fabric. The same blue fabric she had noticed caught beneath the canine's harness. Her heartbeat quickened. Before she could ask anyone about it, the dog pushed past her and moved toward the bed. The doctors shouted for him to stop. Elena raised her hand. Everyone froze. The canine did not jump onto the patient. He simply stood beside the bed and lowered his head until his nose rested near the man's hand. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the unconscious man's fingers moved. Barely. So slightly that Elena almost thought she imagined it. The dog noticed. His ears lifted. His entire body changed. He made a soft sound deep in his throat, something between a whimper and a breath. Elena stepped closer. She looked at the patient, then at the dog, and finally at the broken leash dragging across the floor. The hospital doors were several hundred feet away. There was no obvious way this animal could have found this room. No handler stood beside him. No police officer had arrived. No one had given the hospital staff any information. Yet somehow, through rain, traffic, noise, and locked doors, the K9 had crossed the city and found this exact bed. Elena quietly asked where the dog had come from. A security officer answered that the animal had been seen running alone through the hospital parking lot. Nobody knew how long he had been there. Nobody knew who he belonged to. Then one of the paramedics who had brought the unidentified patient stepped into the doorway. His face changed when he saw the dog. He took a single step backward. Elena noticed immediately. She asked him if he knew the animal. The paramedic said nothing. His eyes remained fixed on the silver tag hanging from the harness. Elena reached toward it, but before her fingers could touch the metal, the paramedic whispered something that made the entire room go still. The dog's name was Ranger. And according to the paramedic, Ranger's handler was supposed to be somewhere else entirely. The words settled over the room with a weight Elena could feel before anyone spoke again. Ranger. The name seemed to change the animal in front of them. His ears lifted at the sound, and his eyes moved immediately toward the paramedic. The man swallowed hard and stepped farther into the room. He explained that Ranger was not a stray, not a hospital therapy dog, and certainly not an animal that should have been wandering through the city alone. He belonged to a K9 handler assigned to a nearby emergency response unit, a man named Daniel Mercer. Daniel and Ranger had worked together for years. They had trained together, traveled together, and responded to emergencies together. They were rarely separated. Yet Daniel had not arrived at the hospital with Ranger. Elena looked at the patient on the bed. The unconscious man was still unidentified. No wallet. No phone. No family. Nothing except muddy boots and a strip of blue fabric. She asked the paramedic whether Daniel Mercer was the man in the bed. The paramedic hesitated. Then he said no. Elena felt a strange chill move through her. If the patient was not Daniel, why had Ranger crossed the city to find him? Ranger suddenly turned away from the bed and began pulling toward the hallway. Security stepped forward again. Elena stopped them. The dog's breathing had become faster. He looked at Elena, then toward the exit, then back at the patient. He was trying to tell them something. The problem was that nobody knew how to listen. Hospital administration ordered security to remove the animal. The emergency department had strict rules. Animals could not enter treatment areas without authorization. The hospital was already overcrowded, and the situation was becoming a distraction. Elena understood the rules. She also understood that rules were written for ordinary circumstances, and this was no ordinary circumstance. She asked the paramedic what had happened before the patient arrived. He explained that an ambulance crew had found the man near a damaged vehicle several miles from the hospital. There had been no obvious identification. No one had witnessed the accident. But one detail had confused the crew. The man's hand had been tightly closed around a small piece of blue cloth. Elena looked again at the strip tied to the patient's boot. Then at Ranger. The dog was staring at it. She asked a nurse to bring the evidence bag containing the man's belongings. Inside was a broken watch, a key, several coins, and a folded photograph that had been dampened by rain. Elena carefully opened the photograph. It showed Daniel Mercer standing beside Ranger. Both were younger. Both were looking toward the camera. Behind them was a familiar training facility. Elena turned the photograph over. There was a handwritten date on the back, followed by 4 words.
Never leave him behind.
She stared at the sentence.
The paramedic went silent. Ranger gave a quiet whine. Elena suddenly understood that the photograph had not been carried by accident. Someone had wanted it to be found. But who?
Before she could ask, a doctor called her name from the hallway. The patient's condition was changing.
Elena returned to the bedside, and Ranger followed.
She watched the monitor, listened to the doctor's instructions, and tried to keep her mind focused on the patient.
Yet something kept bothering her.
The patient had arrived without identification, but he had been carrying a photograph of Ranger and Daniel.
The dog had somehow found him. And now the animal refused to leave. Elena leaned closer to the patient's hand and noticed a faint movement.
His fingers curled around something. She gently asked him to open his hand. There was no response. Then Ranger placed his nose against the man's wrist. The patient's fingers moved again.
A doctor noticed it too. Everyone became quiet.
For several seconds, the room contained only the soft sounds of medical equipment and the rain tapping against the distant windows.
Elena looked at Ranger.
The dog remained perfectly still. Then the patient's eyes opened.
Not fully.
Just enough to reveal that he was conscious.
Elena asked him if he could hear her.
His lips moved, but no sound came out. She leaned closer.
He tried again.
This time she heard one broken word.
Daniel. The room changed instantly. Elena asked him where Daniel was. The man's eyes filled with fear.
He tried to lift his arm but could not. Ranger began pacing beside the bed.
Elena gently told him to stay calm.
The patient looked toward the dog. His expression softened. Then he whispered another word. Bridge.
Elena looked at the paramedic. The paramedic's face had gone pale.
He stepped into the hallway and made a phone call.
Minutes later, 2 officers arrived at the hospital.
They confirmed something nobody had expected. Daniel Mercer had disappeared several hours earlier during a response call near the river. His vehicle had been found abandoned. Ranger had vanished shortly afterward. Search teams had been looking for the K9 but had found no trace.
Elena stared at Ranger. The animal had not escaped.
He had been searching. And somehow, he had led them to the one person who knew where Daniel was. But there was still one problem. The patient could barely speak, and the only word he could repeat was bridge. The officers wanted to question him immediately. The doctors refused because he was too weak. Security wanted Ranger removed. Elena refused again. She stood between the dog and the people demanding answers, realizing that the animal might be their only remaining connection to Daniel. Then Ranger suddenly turned toward the window. His body stiffened. His ears rose. He began scratching urgently at the floor beside the patient's bed. Elena looked down. Beneath the edge of the bed was a small black device. She picked it up and recognized it instantly. It was a tracking beacon used by emergency response teams. The screen was still active. A single location blinked on it. Elena looked at the officers. One of them checked the coordinates and went completely silent. The signal was not coming from the hospital. It was coming from somewhere near the river. And it was moving.
For several seconds, nobody in the emergency room moved. The small tracking device continued blinking in Elena's hand, its signal shifting slowly across the map toward the river. One of the officers grabbed his radio and called for a response team, but Ranger was already moving. He stood beside the hospital bed, staring at the screen as though he understood exactly what it meant. Elena finally understood why he had come. He had not brought danger into the hospital. He had brought a warning. The injured man had found a way to carry the tracking beacon with him, knowing that someone might eventually discover it. Ranger had followed its signal, found the man, and then refused to leave because the message was not complete. Daniel was still out there. The officers rushed toward the exit, but Elena stopped them for one final question. She asked the injured man if Daniel was alive. His eyes closed for a moment. Then he nodded. Barely. Ranger let out a soft sound and turned toward the doors. Elena looked at the dog and felt something shift inside her. For hours, everyone had been asking what Ranger had done wrong. Nobody had asked what he had come to do. The hospital doors opened again, and the K9 disappeared into the rain beside the response team. Elena remained behind with the injured man, watching the red lights vanish through the glass. She could have gone home after her shift. She could have told herself that the emergency was no longer hers. Instead, she stayed. Nearly 40 minutes later, the radio message arrived. The search team had found Daniel. He was alive, trapped inside an overturned vehicle near the riverbank. The beacon had led them directly to him. Ranger had been right. But the story did not end there. Daniel was brought to the hospital before dawn, exhausted and injured but conscious. When the ambulance doors opened, Ranger was waiting. The K9 walked toward him slowly. For the first time since entering the emergency room, the animal did not look frightened or desperate. He simply stood beside his handler. Daniel lowered his hand and rested it against Ranger's head. Neither moved for several seconds. The room seemed to quiet around them. Nurses stopped working. A doctor paused in the hallway. Even the security officer who had demanded Ranger be removed stood at a distance and watched. Elena looked toward the unidentified patient. He was awake now. His name was Thomas Reed, a volunteer search worker who had been driving along the river when he discovered Daniel's damaged vehicle. Thomas had tried to help. When he realized Daniel was trapped and losing consciousness, he took the tracking beacon and ran toward the road for assistance. But another vehicle struck his car before he could reach anyone. Thomas had been injured, and the beacon had fallen beneath the hospital bed unnoticed. His only hope had been that someone would understand why he was carrying it. Ranger had understood. The blue fabric had been another clue. Thomas had torn a piece from Daniel's emergency jacket so Ranger could recognize his scent if they became separated. What everyone had mistaken for a random piece of cloth was actually a promise between two strangers trying to make sure a life was not lost. Elena stood beside Thomas's bed and finally understood the sentence written on the back of the photograph. Never leave him behind. It had not been a command to Ranger alone. It was the principle Daniel had lived by. And now, without knowing Thomas, without knowing the hospital, without knowing whether anyone would believe him, Ranger had followed that same principle. The animal had refused to abandon the only person who carried a chance of saving his handler. Elena remembered the moment Ranger first entered the emergency room. She remembered the screams, the fear, the hands pulling children away, the officers preparing to restrain him. Everyone had seen a dangerous animal. Almost nobody had seen a frightened friend trying to deliver a message. Later that morning, Daniel asked Elena what happened. She told him that Ranger had found Thomas, that Thomas had carried the beacon, and that the signal had led the search team to him. Daniel listened quietly. Then he looked toward Ranger. His eyes filled with tears. Elena expected him to say something profound. Instead, he simply reached down and touched the dog's collar. Sometimes, she realized, the deepest gratitude does not need words. A few weeks later, Daniel returned to the hospital for follow-up treatment. Thomas was recovering too. The two men had never met before that night, yet the accident had tied their lives together in a way neither could have predicted. Thomas later told Elena that he had been afraid to ask for help because he thought nobody would believe his story about the K9. Elena smiled when she heard that. She understood. The world had almost punished Ranger for arriving in the wrong place, at the wrong time, under the wrong circumstances. Yet the very thing that frightened everyone had been the reason a missing man came home alive. Elena kept thinking about that long after the emergency room returned to its ordinary rhythm. Patients arrived. Ambulances came and went. Monitors beeped through the night. People complained about waiting. Families prayed in corners. Life continued without announcing how close it had come to ending for someone. And somewhere beyond the hospital walls, Ranger continued doing what he had always done. Finding the person who needed him. Protecting the one who could not protect himself. Refusing to walk away simply because everyone else had decided the situation was too complicated. Elena eventually understood that compassion does not always look gentle when it first arrives. Sometimes it arrives covered in rain, breathing hard, breaking through a door everyone else wants closed. Sometimes it stands in front of you and asks you to look twice before deciding what you are seeing. The night Ranger entered the emergency room, everyone panicked because they saw an animal they did not understand. Elena was the one person who stopped long enough to ask what he was trying to say. And that small decision changed 2 lives. Perhaps that is what kindness really asks of us, not to have all the answers, but to pause long enough to notice when someone is carrying a message we are not yet ready to hear. Because sometimes the one thing everyone is trying to push away is the very thing that came to lead us home. And if this story reminded you that compassion can appear in the most unexpected form, pass it gently to someone who might need that reminder today.